Welcome to the 12th District in session. I'm Kerry Condata, former state legislator, with you today. The session is starting to wind down. We're heading towards April 28th. That'll be the last day of the main session, the regular session, but we could go into overtime if these budgets are not negotiated quickly. That is what is starting right now. The House and Senate are exchanging bills and voting off the floor. We will try to reach our legislators today, but that is questionable because they are on the floor voting. This is the time of year it gets very hectic, a lot of caucus, a lot of bills to examine, and a lot to vote on. So we hopefully will get at least one of our legislators on the air. And at the end of this program today, we'll do a new feature called the Inslee Report to give you an update on Jay Inslee's presidential campaign. He didn't have a very good week, and you'll find out more about that at the end of this show. We'll be right back to discuss the main issue today, the McCleary decision, the McCleary fix, or is it a fix? We're going to give you the full background on that because there seems to be a lot of confusion about exactly what's happening with education funding. We'll take it from the year 2000 forward and tell you what really happened. You'll only get it here on the 12th District in session. We'll be right back. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. The 12th District is in session. We will try to reach our legislators later in the hour, although they are on the floor voting on bills. We're not sure whether they'll be able to break away or not, but we'll make every attempt to at least get a short report. We are kind of in the middle of things as the Senate and House are both reporting and voting on bills, and they are negotiating behind closed doors, I'm sure, on budgets with only a few weeks to go. We'll see if we can get that update for you. In the meantime, we want to get to the issue of the day. One of the big bills that is looming over there, especially for taxpayers, is a bill for the education system to raise the levy lid that was put in place by the McCleary decision, that was put in place to reduce the dependence on local taxes and let the state pay its fair share. This is what started the whole thing. Speaking of starting the whole thing, let's take it back just a bit further. We're going to review the entire McCleary timeline with you. Frankly, it started long before McCleary. It started in the year 2000 with two initiatives that were passed by the people on the promise that it wouldn't increase taxes, to reduce class size. That was Initiative 728, and then to give the teachers a yearly COLA, actually, which was I-732. These two initiatives both passed. Again, they were passed under the premise of no tax increases, although both of them were quite costly. What went on in the next few years was very interesting and very concerning to the WEA, the teachers union, and other educators, that these were pretty much put on the back burner. There was some funding for class size, but I-732, the teachers' COLA, was put on hold several times during a number of different budget sessions. I was one of the ones that did support that because I felt if we didn't give the teachers the COLAs, we were going to run into a much bigger problem, and that's exactly what happened several years down the road. After I-732 was suspended a number of times, the teachers union said enough is enough, and they went directly to the courts with what became the McCleary case. The McCleary case was filed in 2007 by two families that said that basically they stated that education was not being funded by the state. It was being funded on the backs of local taxpayers, and so that case was brought to order. It took many years for it to come through, but in the interim between 2007 and when the decision was made in 2012, almost 5 years later, some interesting things happened in the courts. In the Supreme Court of Washington State, the few conservatives that were left were voted out of office by rather large campaigns for new Superior Court judges, or I should say Supreme Court judges, that were financed. These were some of the biggest campaigns ever waged against these conservatives, financed primarily by the WEA. That's right, the teachers union was one of the largest contributors to these folks, and in the process, the Supreme Court became much more liberal and much more, I would say, adaptive, or maybe a little more WEA oriented than it was under the previous situation where we actually had a few conservatives and some middle-of-the-roaders. The court became quite liberal and now is one of the most liberal Supreme Courts in the United States. So in 2012, that very court decided that indeed the schools were not funded properly and instructed the legislature to move forward on changing that, come up with a plan. They gave them a few years to do it. And legislature it was a pretty slow move getting going, but they did start to move in that direction. In 2014, the courts say they'd had enough of the tail dragging on this thing. They just were not happy with the progress the legislature was making. So in 2014, the Supreme Court found in contempt of court, the legislature was in contempt of court and fined them $100,000 a day, every day that they didn't come up with a solution to McCleary. This definitely put the legislature in overdrive, but there was also a constitutional problem at this point that really never came to pass. There was a lot of people that understood. The legislature is the independent arm of a three-piece government, and the Supreme Court really can't budget. What they can do, this statement and the findings they made were completely accurate as far as the saying that the state was not funding education. That's okay. But to put a timeline on it and to assign a value to it was very questionable, and they more or less did have a timeline and an amount, even though they never really stated what that amount was. The Supreme Court said, we'll let you know when you get there. So year after year passes, the legislature continues to fund schools at a pretty brisk pace and comes up with the McCleary plan, or the McCleary fix as it was known to us in the legislature. And that McCleary plan basically had a few highlights to it. It increased K-12 education spending by $8 billion over 4 years, reduced local levies in the 4th year. This is a key component of this plan. And there was a basic education definition of sorts, although it was never primarily defined. There was a segment between extra spending and basic education. And there was a very important part you didn't hear much about, a hold harmless that added that no school would go backwards on funding, because there are disparities in the property tax situations around the state and the way that's levied. There was concern that some districts might actually lose money under this plan, and there was a hold harmless to make sure they didn't. Depending on the levy rates, some school districts lost more, some didn't lose as much. But here is where things got a little sideways. The 4-year plan was to increase the state portion over 4 years and then reduce the levy lid in the 4th year to $1.50 per thousand. Well, the courts weren't quite happy with that and really scrambled the plan by moving up the last payment into the 3rd year. So the 4th year payment, the court said we had to move it into the 3rd year, which created a tremendous bubble in the terms of the finances. Schools received a huge amount in the 3rd year, and remember, the levies were still at their full amount, depending on when the levies came due and when they were renewed. They were still getting all that levy money, so this created a bubble that was not in the original plan. This is where the WEA stepped in and really went to task. You saw threats of strikes. You saw a lot of action on their side to really push these school districts to renegotiate. And the school districts at this point were feeling pretty flush, so they did. They negotiated some unbelievable contracts. Some were only 6 or 8%. Some were 22 to 28%. But there was a huge amount of salary increase included for the teachers in this particular flush year. This is the problem, and this is what came back to haunt folks, because the next year, in the 4th year, they'd already gotten the 4th year of increase in spending, which now $8 billion had been spent, but the local levies had to be reduced to $1.50. Suddenly, some school districts felt they came up short. Even with additional dollars, they came up short because they, frankly, negotiated contracts they really couldn't afford going forward under the original plan. Of course, we weren't working with the original plan at that time. So when this year came around, there was a big push to do what? Raise the local levy lid back up from $1.50. Well, folks, that's what McCleary was all about. It was about shifting money back to the state and away from local levies, and that's why the lid of $1.50 was put on. So the very essence of McCleary is currently being challenged, particularly in the Senate, by a bill to raise that levy lid. Now, some people, and myself included, might think this was kind of the plan all along. We saw it coming. We saw that people were complaining about the $1.50 lid even after the $8 billion were injected, and that there was probably going to be a push to raise that lid back up, which would put us right back in the same position, except with a much wealthier situation in education, with a total bill well over 50% of the total spending in Washington state. So that bill was proceeding through the Senate quite nicely until an interesting point. It was, of course, supported heavily by the WEA again, until a couple of Democrat senators said, wait a minute. And interestingly enough, one of them has a wife that is a teacher, and he said, look, my wife's a teacher, I get this, but there's something wrong here. The whole idea of the $1.50 was for added benefits for programs outside of teachers' salaries in basic education, and to raise it up to finance more teachers' salaries just didn't make any sense to him. He found another colleague, and they hung an amendment that said, it severely limited that amount of money to teacher salaries. Basically said we're going to freeze that part and actually reduce it over a period of years so that other areas of financing can be handled. Well, this brings us to this interesting point when the WEA was supporting this bill, pushing it hard until the teachers' salaries were removed, and suddenly they are against the bill. They come out in huge opposition to this because, folks, underneath it was all about teachers' salaries, and that's the point of this whole story. 14 minutes of background on McCleary says it was all driven by the WEA to start with. They got what they wanted by moving up the money and now want even more. And that's just not going to fly with a lot of folks in the legislature, including a couple of very brave Democrats that saw the scam, which I believe it is, and stopped it in its tracks. We'll be right back with the 12th District in session. Welcome back to the 12th District, and we are going in session. Lucky enough to have Keith Gaynor with us today, who has been on the floor voting. Keith, welcome aboard. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule, and tell us what's going on in Olympia right now.
Well, that's a good question. I think a lot of us are asking that question.
I was afraid you'd say that.
The way the actual schedule is going right now, we're being called to the floor. We go in and we get a list of bills that they're ready to run to have votes on, and you know that the votes are already pretty much tallied up if that bill is coming to the floor. But then we go to our respective caucuses, and then we may come out. We may run those bills. We may not. We may get a different set. There's just a lot of uncertainty right now. And there's some very, when I say controversial, and some bills that are really kind of touch and go as far as what the support really is for them. So those things are being negotiated, and we're just kind of waiting and seeing what we'll be voting on from day to day. But what we're dealing with right now are all the bills that have gone that have come over from the Senate, and then we will either amend them or adopt them as they've come to us, and then they'll go straight to the governor if they aren't amended.
Now, one of the bills that's kind of controversial is the truancy bill that came through. It has to do with the Becca situation. Can you tell us just briefly what that's all about?
Well, we had an interesting floor discussion. I mean, the concern, there was plenty of discussion about how this is a critical component to have detention as an option. The Becca bill started with a family that felt that their daughter was out of control. They couldn't do anything with her, I mean, from a legal standpoint, because she hadn't committed any crimes. And unfortunately for her, she was found murdered in a Spokane park. And the parents then lobbied the legislature, the same legislature that just voted to do away with detention as an option, or as a way to actually put your kid in a situation where there is some control over them. And that same legislature back in '95 voted to set aside beds. I know that in Chelan County we've had what we call Becca beds that have been available for kids that need to have a safe space. And yet what we did here this week, yesterday, was vote not to have that program in place. So there was a lot of concern that if we could just fund these beds, these crisis beds for kids, it would be very. It's necessary. I mean, it doesn't happen a lot, but when it does happen, those are precious lives that may possibly be lost, and we're really concerned about that. But I mean, this is the direction we're going. We'll see how that works out.
Yeah, we thought the Becca bill was working quite well, to tell you the truth. However, the budgets now, we talked about the budgets last week. I imagine those are in negotiation mostly behind closed doors. Can you give us any update on transportation or capital at this point?
The transportation and capital bills, I think, as far as I'm, seeing, they're just kind of sitting there waiting to see how the negotiations will develop. There really hasn't been much change. The unfortunate thing, in these budgets is that, we have to make sure that the funding is there, and it appears that for both transportation on the House side, there is for the budget that was rolled out. But if there are changes from the Senate side when they go to negotiate, if there's some sort of revenue package that's associated with the Senate side, well, that obviously would have to be, worked through. But from the House side, transportation-wise, there was no further, revenue mechanism in place. From the capital budget side, they had the amount of money that they could commit, which they did. Now the House, as you've heard, Representative Steele talk about, left more of a reserve than what the Senate did. So that will probably have to be worked out also.
Well, it's kind of interesting on the transportation side. There was an article out this week that said that Washington State has the highest gas prices in the continental United States, but certainly the roads didn't rank anywhere near the top of the list. Is that something that concerns you?
Very much so. I mean, you've heard me talk about preservation, being a high priority. I mean, I experienced that as a, county commissioner, and I heard from county commissioners across the state, and they're the ones that are closest to those roads that need a lot of repair. And then obviously with the DOT and the major roads that they are responsible for and the projects that they've been working on, we don't have the money because we've bonded it all. And so, as we talk now, I mean, what's happened on the transportation discussion in the last week or so, we've talked about tolling. What will we do with that? We've talked about raising ferry fares, that there would be a surcharge on those ferries to help offset some of the costs there. But, it's going to be a challenge to just maintain what we have, let alone, expand any new projects and, provide more efficient, delivery of the, the infrastructure. So, I'm not sure where that's going to go either. I mean, I think we have to get practical and realize that we have a certain amount of roads that have to be kept in very good shape, because those are the roads that deliver our goods and services to our citizens, and that needs to be, our highest priority. And then, what we can do with discretionary dollars, if there are any, be very careful how we, advance with those. But, we've talked too, and I just can't understate the bridge issue at all, because I mean that is so critical. I mean, those are things that are so costly because of all the environmental impacts that have to be dealt with, and the cost of of replacing that in that infrastructure is it's going to be cost prohibitive if we continue to prolong getting on a systematic replacement plan to the bridges that we have in our state.
And speaking of transportation, that lovely little bill to put stickers on gas pumps, or at least continue to do it, is still hung up over there in the Senate. It just doesn't look like that's going to move for you this year.
Well, as you well know, because it was your efforts that got it in as a proviso, and I came and they said, well, it's a good freshman bill. It's a no-brainer. It'll slide right through. And it did for the most part. But we got it over to the Senate. It passed through, the House fine. Got to the Senate, and I had to lobby to get a hearing for it. I did get the hearing, and then now to get it, pulled out, get it exec, get it approved by the committee to actually move forward. It doesn't appear that I have the support right now. And yet, when you talk to individuals, they say, well, it's not really, it shouldn't be a problem. But evidently, the people that are drawing up the agendas see it as a problem. So what seemed to be a small, innocuous bill, a no-brainer. There's something about that transparency and the full disclosure of individuals' investments in the road system for each tank of gas that they buy. For some reason, there's a reason for us not to disclose that to the public.
Well, that is interesting, especially since it looks like any gas tax increase at this point is not going to happen. At least that's what some of my Senate connections are saying. But of course, it would make it more difficult in the next session as more and more people see those stickers. All right, Keith, I know you got to get back to the floor. Is there anything you want to add before you go back? I suspect by next week we'll have a much better feel on the budgets. What else do you think we're going to see between now and next week?
I'm not so sure what you're going to see even next week on the budgets. The last thing I heard just within the last day now is that they may not even start having serious discussions until next week. And we've only got a couple weeks to go. They do need to get very get right down to the basic brass tacks, I guess, for lack of a better term, to determine where are we going to end up financially. If people have any, questions or concerns, and we do have that toll-free number that they can call, 1-800-562-6000, 1-800-562-6000.
Well, before you go, there was an interesting twist in the Senate. One of my big concerns in the bills is property taxes. That's always been a pet peeve of mine. They tried to lift the levy lid, the local levy lid, and two Democrat senators stepped in and put an amendment in to stop teachers from getting any of that money, essentially, and it kind of stalled it. Are you hearing anything about the levy lid lift on your side? Because I think that's a big deal for folks over here.
No, I think I heard, basically what you've heard, and I haven't heard really any more about how that will proceed on the House side.
All right. Well, we don't need any higher property taxes over here. It's bad enough. All right, Keith, thanks a lot for taking the time out. We will see you next week. Hopefully we'll have a chance to get caught up and see where those budgets are. But really good that you're seeing it come to an end. There's light at the end of the tunnel, you hope. Well, I guess we'll know more next week. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
All right, there you have it from Keith Gaynor, a little background on what's going on. This is kind of the doldrums part of the session because, frankly, budgets are starting to be negotiated behind closed doors, and that'll go on right to the end. And those big votes won't come until the last few days of the session. But in the meantime, there's a lot of very scary policy bills that are out there. And, well, we'll just see what happens. By next week, we should have most of the policy bills put aside and be firmly planted into the budget and the taxes which accompany those budgets. We'll be right back to wrap it up with our Jay Inslee report, the first of its kind, right here on the 12th District. Welcome back. Well, there you have it. A report from the legislature. Will be keeping you up to date for the next few weeks as we get closer to the end. We hope the end without a special session in sight. We don't know that right now. All right, let's take a look at the Inslee report. This is a report on the presidential campaign of Jay Inslee, our governor, and he had his first national exposure here the other day and didn't go so well for him. First, he stated the Electoral College must go because we need to return to a democracy in the United States, where several people reminded Jay that this is a republic, not a democracy. He also could not answer a simple question about recycling, even though his entire campaign is based on environmental issues. The question was really quite simple, and he said he did not have an answer, but he would get back to the folks at another time. And last but not least, Jay is trying desperately to get off the 0% number, which is what he's rated or ranked at across the United States. You'd think that the people of Washington State alone could get him to 1%. If they were supporting him. And that's the Jay Inslee report for this week. That'll be it for the 12th District. We'll go back in session next week and get you caught up on those budgets as we wind the session down and prepare for that last day on the 28th, we hope. Thanks for joining us. This is Kerry Condata for NCW Life. We'll return next week with the 12th District in session.